changed on the day that I met someone who looked just like me. Now, I'll tell you, I'm a practical kind of guy. The kind who doesn't get swept up in grand ideas and idle talk. I'm a fan of action, of moving forward, of getting things done. And so, the first time I heard about this Jesus was from my friend John, and he told me about this man that he'd met, and he'd heard him speaking, and he was just totally amazed by all the things that he heard. Now, the truth is, I really didn't have much interest in going to hear him. That was John's kind of thing. He was always getting caught up with all these teachers and stuff. Well, first there was that other guy, that other John, John the Baptist, and he loved to go and hear him speak and follow him. And then, along came Jesus. And John and Andrew, who's another one of our friends, they went to see what he was all about. But not me. I mean, someone has got to keep the fish coming in, someone's got to keep the nets being mended, someone's got to keep food on the table for everyone at the end of the day, and I'm the kind of guy who can be counted on to do that. I'm not afraid of a hard day's work. I'm not even afraid of all the danger that comes from being a fisherman out on the Sea of Galilee with all the storms and stuff. I don't mind a little bit of adventure, for the most part. But I am dependable, and I like to get things done. But John was completely captivated by this man that he'd met, this Jesus. It's the craziest thing, Thomas, he said to me. He looks just like you, but... And then he trailed away, just like that, like he was caught up in some sort of daydream. And it was the curiosity that finally did me in. I finally decided to go and see what this Jesus was about, who apparently looked a little bit like me, just to see what John kept going on about. And Andrew, too. Andrew, when he talked about Jesus, he couldn't contain his amazement. And then when Andrew took his little brother Peter to see Jesus, well, I've never heard a grown man go on about another man so much in my whole life. I mean, Simon Peter fell under his spell, too. So I went too, and the first time I saw him, I assumed that was going to be the last time. After all, someone has to get on with life, don't they? Someone's got to bring in the fish. And it seemed as if every other person who met this Jesus was so crazy about him that they would drop everything and follow him. And so I went. And I was totally blown away. Well, John was certainly right about one thing. We looked exactly alike. In fact, I received one of the very first nicknames that Jesus ever gave anybody. He looked right at me, and he said, well, it appears that I have a twin. And then from then on, it stuck. I was Didymus, or the twin, from then on. But when Jesus turned his eyes on me, that's what I'll remember even more than the nickname. It was like he could look right into my soul, and he could see everything that I'd ever done, or ever even thought about. I tell you, it was kind of a rather unpleasant experience, to be honest. I mean, who wants someone to see everything they've ever said or done or thought, especially this amazing teacher that everyone just was so captivated by? But then he smiled at me, a radiant smile. It was almost as disarming as his gaze. And I knew that even though Jesus had seen the worst things about me, he'd also seen the best things about me. And I could tell that I was completely loved and completely accepted by this man. And it was a feeling that I'd never had before or since with anyone. I still don't know what he saw in me, to be very honest. I mean, there's nothing very special about me. I'm the guy who keeps us moving, who looks after our practical needs, that's all. But as I said, my life changed completely on that day when I first went to see him. And I only went to see him because my friend wouldn't leave me alone until I came along. And when I first saw him and I heard him call my name, well, I knew that I was going to follow him wherever he went. Plain, old, ordinary Thomas became special because Jesus called him out, called him to follow him. It was almost as if I left the old Thomas behind and I became the twin from then on, because I always wanted to be as near to Jesus as I could. And I saw some pretty amazing things too. Like the first time, we went to a wedding, and just after Jesus had asked me to follow him, and we saw him change these huge stone jars of water into wine of all things. Not too many people know what had happened, They thought that the bridegroom had a secret stash of wine in the back somewhere, but we knew. We saw. And if my fate as his follower wasn't sealed by that time, well, that did it. I knew that I would follow a guy who would do such amazing things for the people he cared about. I knew I would follow him wherever he would go. And I was completely amazed and I was humbled that he cared for me. And you know, the signs that he performed, it didn't stop with changing water into wine. I saw Jesus heal people. People who had been blind since they were born or who had been unable to walk for over 30 years. People that other people couldn't seem to see because they just become part of the scenery, lying around, begging, sitting by a healing pool or whatever. But Jesus would look right at them, just as he'd once looked at me, and I knew that it just wasn't some sort of trick or gimmick. Jesus cared so much about every person that we met. He made everyone's life better that he came across. Though he didn't usually do it in the way that we would normally expect or think of. I mean, he talked to people with such compassion, such care. He talked to people who had leprosy, people who were poor. He talked to women, people who the rest of us didn't even notice. But there he was talking to them, listening to them, healing them. We didn't seem to be able to keep him away from people, in fact, even when he was tired. I mean, there were times when Jesus would just have to take off by himself. And we all understood. I mean, it was exhausting having so many people around. And we all needed downtime every once in a while. But if there was a need, Jesus was right there. That's actually what happened the time that we had that huge crowd of people following us. They just needed somebody to talk to them. They needed a shepherd. Needed someone to tell them about God and to tell them about things that Jesus always seemed to know how to say. We were all so tired, Jesus included. And we were just trying to go off by ourselves for a bit to have a bit of alone time. But this great crowd who'd seen all of the amazing things that Jesus did, they just followed right along. And he taught all day long. So much so that our stomachs were rumbling by the time he was finished. And then we were rather dismayed when Jesus suggested that we could feed the entire crowd. Of course, we thought it was out of his mind. Of course, we couldn't feed them. But somehow, he could. And he did. And there was so much food left over from that time. You see, when Jesus showed his power, he really showed his power. But it's not that Jesus always told people what they wanted to hear, however, or that he always did everything that they wanted. In fact, that time with all the food, so many people loved this trick with the fish and the loaves that they just kept following us around, waiting for some more of that. But Jesus had some pretty harsh words for them about how they were only after food to feed their bellies and not food to feed their souls, which is what they really needed anyway. But what he told them about feeding on him instead of on bread, well, it was so offensive that a whole bunch of that crowd, they just got up and left. They went away. But I stayed, as did most of his closest followers, those of us who knew him best. Now, I'm not going to say that those times weren't confusing or even a little bit frightening. But there was something about Jesus that made us all want to follow him, even when we didn't quite understand what was going on, or even when we didn't really like what he had to say. Then there was the way that he would talk to the Pharisees and those other people who knew about God and religion. I mean, those were guys I had hardly any contact with in my other life. I mean, they were out of my league. They're the kind of people that know all about God and who told the rest of us what we should be doing and how we needed to relate to God. Some of them actually accepted Jesus, like Nicodemus. I remember how he came slinking over to us one night under cover of darkness, but he had his life changed by whatever it was that Jesus said to him, just like I once had. And Nicodemus, he always spoke up for Jesus after that. But it didn't usually do much good, because among the Pharisees and the teachers of the law, he was a minority. And I guess I can see why. I mean, for heaven's sakes, some of the things he said to them, he was a braver man than I ever was, talking to them like that. It was like we couldn't get him to be quiet about those things that he felt strongly about, even when it was in his best interests, even when it could save his skin. But that was never much of a concern for him. He knew what he was in for. You know, he even told us about it. And none of us like to hear him talk about it, myself included. Sometimes we thought he was just talking crazy talk, foolishness, when he talked about how he had to die and how he had to go away. I mean, the guy could create wine out of water. He could command bread and fish to feed the masses. He could heal anyone he came across. He had trouble believing that he wouldn't be able to get out of whatever it was that would have killed him. You know, we'd been in some near scrapes when the folks in power were trying to arrest him because they didn't like what he had to say to all those powerful religious guys, like the Pharisees. Or they were worried that he was going to upset the Roman rulers and that would bring their wrath down on everyone. At one time, he got the entire crowd so worked up, saying that he was the Son of God, that they were actually picking up stones and they were going to kill Jesus for blaspheming against God. But somehow we all managed to just slip away, even just narrowly. Jesus told us that was because it was not yet his time. But you know, if he could walk out of messes like that, out of angry crowds, then it seemed that his time never had to come at all. Or at least, it did for a while. And then there was the issue with Lazarus. Now Lazarus and his sisters, Mary and Martha, they were close friends of Jesus. And they saw a whole lot of us too, because we were his followers. And we spent a lot of time there when we were traveling around teaching and healing. And then we got word that Lazarus was sick. And we all knew what was going to happen. We all knew Jesus would charge back and heal him because he could heal anybody, right? But Jesus rather unexpectedly did not hurry back that time. Instead, we stayed where we were for a few more days. And we were all really worried about Lazarus, Jesus included. But we knew why he decided not to go back. You see, Mary, Martha, and Lazarus, they lived near Jerusalem. And Jerusalem was just crawling with people who were trying to get their hands on Jesus, who wanted to kill him. And as much as we cared about Lazarus, we knew that we couldn't get to him without Jesus risking his life. It was sad, but what could we be expected to do? But then, a couple of days later, Jesus made the announcement that now was the time that we're going to head to Mary and Martha and Lazarus. We were completely incredulous. Surely Jesus knew how dangerous that was for him. Wasn't that why we hadn't gone in the first place? But one word that I could never use to describe Jesus is the word predictable. As scared as I was for Jesus and as scared as I was for myself, if I'm completely honest, I had signed on to follow him. And I would not let him down this time. If he was heading back into danger, if he was going back to Jerusalem, well, I was going to head there with him. And I said so too. I said, let's go too, that we may die with him, I told the others. And that's just what we did. You see, that time, I expected we were heading to our deaths, even my own death. And I was okay with that, really. At least I would die for a reason. At least I would die trying to serve and protect this man who had come to be so much more than a teacher to me. He had given me a reason to live, to keep going on. He was the one who had the words of eternal life. And I knew that I wanted to lay down my life for him. But instead of dying on this trip, we were totally blown away by what happened next. When we got to Bethany, we found that Lazarus had already died. The trip, the danger, it was for nothing except to go and grieve our friend. And so we did grieve, all of us, including Jesus. Jesus cried as he walked toward that tomb. But then he did the most unexpected thing. He called to Lazarus, "Come out of the tomb!" And he came out. Jesus raised him back to life. Now, I don't have to tell you that after seeing that latest miracle, I knew that nothing could ever harm Jesus. He could perform miracles, he could evade arrest, he got out of sticky situations with enraged crowds, and if that were not enough, he could raise someone from the dead. Surely, there was nothing on this earth that he couldn't do. It was quite a high, actually, realizing that there was nothing that could harm Jesus. It was amazing, it was wonderful. And I remember thinking how lucky I was to be following this man. who could do all things. He was almost a god, it seemed. So imagine our shock when Jesus kept on talking about how he was going to die. You know, about that time, I think I actually started listening to that part. I mean, I believe that there was no force on earth that could harm Jesus if he didn't want it to. And so we headed back to Jerusalem. And you know, there was even a parade into the city and a party. Everyone loved Jesus that day. It was so amazing. They came out in droves to see him. They wanted to see this great man who could even raise people from the dead. Later that week, we were together, and he was teaching all of us. And I was totally blown away when he got up from the table, and he wrapped a towel around his waist, and he washed our hot, sandy, disgusting feet. There were tears in my eyes, honestly, when he looked into my eyes as he touched my feet and dried them with his own precious hands. You know, that night Jesus had a lot to say about how he was going away. He told us that he was going somewhere and that we couldn't follow him. Now this was just something that I couldn't abide. I had walked with him to Bethany when I was convinced that I was going to die alongside him. And now he was saying that we couldn't follow him? Not just yet anyway? You know, Simon Peter, he didn't believe it for 1 minute. He spoke for all of us when he said that we were willing to walk with him to death. We'd done it once already anyway. We were all speechless when Jesus told us that Peter, strong, sure, steady Peter, always the star pupil, would deny that he knew Jesus. I was pretty certain that that was never going to happen. But you know, Jesus wasn't trying to upset us. He was telling these things that were going to happen for a reason. He wanted us to know that even though we would be parted from him, he would never really leave us. That he would leave us with a spirit who would comfort us and continue to teach us. And he told us that ultimately we would be where he was, that we would find our way to be with him. Now, I've already mentioned that I'm not the kind of guy who always gets that kind of spiritual stuff. I mean, John and some of the others, they just ate it up. They were completely rapt when he was saying these things to us. But I just didn't get it. I mean, what was Jesus talking about, I wondered? Where could he possibly be going? And if he was actually going to this place and not going to tell us where it was, how could we possibly follow him? I couldn't keep quiet any longer. Lord, I said, we don't know where you're going. So how can we know the way? And then he said the most amazing words. He said, I am the way, and I am the truth, and I am the life, and the only way to the Father is through me. A shiver went through me. If I knew Jesus, and by that time I thought that I probably did, then I would know the way. I knew that he was taking care of us from beginning to end. My life was completely in his hands, and all I needed to do was trust him. Now, I can't say that I completely understood what he was talking about, but I do know that the deal for my life was sealed a long time ago. Back when I said I would follow him that first day that I met him, back when I kept on following even though the crowd went away, back when I said I would go with him to Jerusalem, even if it meant that we were all going to die. And so I trusted him, honestly, completely, with my whole self, even though I didn't understand everything he said. I knew that when it was important, when the time came, I would understand, and that I would know the way, that I would remember the truth, and that I would have life in Jesus. That's why I was so completely thrown off by what happened next. You see, we went through all of these things. Jesus was talking to us like he really was going away. Like this was stuff that he needed to get us to understand before he left. He was talking to us like he was saying goodbye. And after all of that stuff that I'd seen him do, I mean, I really believed that he was the Son of God. And I thought that meant that there would never be anything on this earth that could harm Jesus. But I was wrong. I was totally floored on that night when the contingent of guards marched into the garden. And there was that purse keeper, standing there with them. He'd left earlier to do who knows what. He was our companion, our friend. Jesus had washed his feet. And that Judas, he wouldn't even meet my gaze when I looked at him, trying to figure out why he was standing there with the enemies. "Who are you looking for?" Jesus asked them. And they replied, "Jesus of Nazareth." "I am he," he replied. And just like all those other near scrapes we've been in, you know what happened? That entire contingent of guards fell down. They couldn't lay a hand on him. And I knew it. We were getting out of this situation, just like we always had. But then, after the whole thing happened again, Jesus said, "I told you that I am he. If you were looking for me, then let these men go." What? Let us go? That meant that Jesus was going to let them arrest him. Peter, for one, Peter didn't believe it. He got out his sword and he struck this guy and he cut off someone's ear. And you know what? We were all getting ready to fight for him. But somehow, Jesus didn't ask us to follow him this time. This time he asked that we be let go. And they arrested him. And they tied him up. This man who'd been able to get out of every near miss for 3 years, evading authorities and dangerous crowds. This man who could heal, who could even raise people from the dead. Just like that. He let them lead him away. And you know, I went away then too. Me and a bunch of the others. Not only was I terrified, and I'm going to be honest and say that I was. I mean, even though I was willing to die for Jesus, I didn't particularly want to die. I wasn't looking for it. But I was also very confused. I mean, what could it mean that Jesus let himself be arrested, let himself be taken away? You know, for a while I thought this might be another one of his grand escapes. You know, this time from the clutches of the guards, and he would sneak out right under the nose of the high priest. Or something. I mean, he had to. He was Jesus, the Son of God. He would surely be back with the rest of us by evening the next day. And we would all be totally amazed again when he told us the story. Amazed, but maybe not surprised. So when that didn't happen, I was completely shocked. When we heard how he had gone first before the high priest, and then to Pilate, and how Pilate had ordered him beaten, and then how Pilate had finally gave in to all the crowds that were calling for them to crucify him and signed his death warrant, I was not only shocked, I was completely crushed. You see, when Jesus died, I knew that I'd lost him. I'd lost the one thing that we had been living for. I lost the way to the Father. I wondered how I could even go on living when this person that I'd given up my entire life for was gone. I was willing to die for him, but now that he was gone, I didn't know how I was going to keep on living. But I had to go on. I put one foot in front of the other, and I tried to pick up the scraps of my life. Nothing seemed quite right. I mean, the colors were dimmer, and the world was totally different now that Jesus was not in it. There were times when I berated myself, feeling foolish for ever daring to believe all those fantastic things that Jesus said, that he was the Son of God, that he was the way to the Father. How could he be those things if he was dead? You know, I even blew off all the others, all those who had gathered together. I guess they gathered for old time's sake, but I didn't need to be reminded of how great things were when Jesus was around. I didn't even know how I could face those others who had been taken in just as I had. And so they were together, hiding from the outside world, hiding from anyone that wanted to harm them. But I wasn't there. I just couldn't be. I was looking for some way to carry on, a way to keep going now that Jesus was gone, and I was pretty certain I wasn't going to find it cowering behind that locked door. But it was John who found me, who figured out that I'd be near the seashore, contemplating picking up my old trade. It was John who told me what had happened, who first told me how Jesus had shown up at their gathering, how he walked right in and hadn't even used the door. But I didn't believe it. I wasn't going to get taken in again. And the others, they tried to tell me too, but I just couldn't believe it. I had to see for myself that it was not some elaborate hoax. I couldn't have my hopes and my dreams dashed another time. And so I uttered those words. I will not believe it until I see the nail marks in his hands, and I will not believe it until I put my finger where the nail was and put my hand into his side. But seeing my friends again, though, that did something to me. And although they kept on telling me that they'd seen Jesus, and I kept meeting with them, he didn't show up again, not for a whole week. And so I didn't believe it. And they could tell themselves whatever they wanted to make themselves feel better, but I needed to get on with life. And looking back is not the way to get ahead. That was until Jesus showed up again. And he turned my life upside down again. It's pretty amazing for the same person to do that twice. And when he showed up, I almost hightailed it out of there. He had to know that I didn't believe what the others had told me. How I thought that every one of them was out of their minds. From Peter and John and Mary on down to Andrew and James. Every single one of them who claimed to have seen Jesus back from the dead. I told myself they were delusional, even crazy. He had to be disappointed in me. He had to be angry with me. How could I doubt him when he as much told us what was going to happen? The words that he'd spoken were going through my head. And they were coming back. Why was I so slow? Why had I not expected this? And Jesus spoke and he said, "Peace be with you." Peace? For us who had run away this hour of need, for us who had abandoned him, who denied him, for me who doubted that he even existed again at all. That's what he said. Peace. Not scolding, not anger, not disappointment, just peace. And then he looked at me again, piercing my soul. He knew what was in my heart. And he even invited me to do the very thing that I had said I needed to do in order to believe. To put my hands in the nail marks in his hands. To put my hand into his side. But just seeing him there among us again, alive. He still looked just like me, like he always had. But now, he had those scars, which were brought about by his love for us. Because he'd agreed to go with the temple guards so that we could be let go. There he was in the flesh. And like that first time that I met him, I was totally unable to resist. I knew that everything he had ever said was completely true. He had defeated death. He really was the Son of God. And now he was standing before me, calling my name once again. And I fell down on my knees before him. And with tears in my eyes, I said, "My Lord and my God." I hadn't lost Jesus after all. Here he was. And it turns out I did know the way to where he was going all along. And from that day on, I followed him. I followed the Spirit that he left wherever it led me. I talked about Jesus to anyone who would listen to me. I didn't worry about how I would get in trouble along the way. From that point on, I never turned my back again. And so here I am, telling you my story. But I'm not telling you these things so that you would understand me and know my story. I'm telling you these things because I want you to meet Jesus. You see, when I met him, my life was completely turned upside down. I followed him for 3 years, and I was completely crushed when he died. But that was not the end. Far from it, that was just the very beginning. Because the same man who turned my life upside down once did it again. And I'm here to tell you that I saw with my own to believing that Jesus is alive. And I spent the rest of my life serving him. Now maybe you are a little bit like me. Maybe you'd like to see before you believe, that you like to try before you buy. I get it. I'm like that myself. In fact, these days I understand I'm no longer known by the nickname the Twin, which I always kind of like because Jesus himself gave it to me. I am now known by the name Doubting Thomas. And while I'm not crazy about that name, I understand why people call me that. And I don't much care anyway, because this isn't my story. This is Jesus' story anyway. Call me whatever you'd like. I'm here to tell you what to call him, what to call Jesus. My Lord and my God. I'm urging you to believe in Jesus, to believe that he is the Messiah, the Son of God. And moreover, I'm not here just so that you believe that in your heads. I want you to believe it with your whole heart. I'm here so that you will know that Jesus is alive and that you too can have a relationship with him. That you can follow him just like I did. Maybe if you hear my story, you will find a way to meet Jesus, and you will allow him to change your story just as he changed mine. Now maybe you want to change places with me. Maybe you want to touch him and see him for yourself. But as Jesus said, even though I was blessed to have received that gift, that Jesus came back and showed me what I needed to see to believe in him once again, he also said that even more blessed were the people who did not see, but who would believe anyway. And by that he meant you. Each and every one of you listening to my story is here because you believed, even though you didn't see. Now I have told you my story, and there are many others who are much more eloquent than I am, who have written down the story of Jesus. They have given you the words and the life of Jesus so that you might begin to believe, or that you might continue to believe. What will you do with our words? Will you be blessed by believing in Jesus and letting him change your whole life? No. Thank you for listening to my story and to his story. Now will you allow Jesus to change your story? Would you pray with me? Lord Jesus, you once said that blessed are those who have not seen and yet believed. We thank you that that includes us. Lord, we want to believe in you, and we pray that you would increase our faith and help us to see you clearly so that you may change our stories. Because we ask this in the strong name of Jesus.